welcome back! You've managed to make your way to the scary side of YouTube land, where I'll guide you from here. For those who are new, I'm Alexa, the resident ooky spooky girly around these parts, here today to dive back into reality-based horror, which is probably what gives me the most nightmares. Aliens, demonic idols, ghosties, demons, they're all kind of comfort material for me. But when it comes to human beings and empty buildings, 50-50. Hospitals serve as a scary place for a lot of people, since it's kind of the last place most of us want to visit unless we absolutely have to. I hope you're all ready to be creeped out, because welcome to the top 5 hospital night shift horror stories. Starting off 5th place strong, we've got a narrowly avoided death. This tale takes place when long-term nurse Jenny was placed in charge of caring for an elderly woman with no family who was admitted to the hospital when her husband passed away. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was usually just words that made no sense together. Jenny felt bad for her because ever since she'd arrived, so many of the residents in her area that she, seemed to enjoy spending time with had passed. She put up a picture of each of them next to the pictures of her husband and several others who were probably just family to remember them. Being an extremely empathetic person, Jenny felt sorry for this woman and strived to give her extra attention whenever she could, and formed a bond with the lady. It just seemed so unfair that she had, such luck and kept losing people that she cared about. One day she looked at Jenny and said, plain as day, "Sweetie, I think I'm done now," and handed Jenny a picture. It was a picture of Jenny, and she smiled because it touched her heart that she was so important to the old woman. She passed nearly a week later, and poor Jenny cried for days from the loss. The old lady knew it was the end, and she said goodbye as best she could. Now fast forward to just under 2 years later, when Jenny was talking with a colleague, and that old lady came up in conversation. Her colleague referred to the lady as that crazy, explicit word for a female dog, which seemed very out of character for her, and it shocked and offended Jenny deeply. She expressed this to her colleague, not so nicely, and the lady looked at Jenny with a shocked look and said, "Oh dear, do you not know?" And then proceeded to explain something to Jenny that, she in fact hadn't known. As it turned out, it came out sometime after she had passed that the old lady had killed her husband by poisoning him, and that there was an investigation because it appeared that she had a ritual of befriending someone, obtaining a picture of them, and hiding the picture until she could kill them, usually by poisoning, and then displaying the picture as some sort of a trophy. It was suspected that this may have been the reason for the spike in mortality rate during her stay, and the considerable amount of photos in her collection. The last Jenny heard, the old family photos weren't any relation to the old woman, and the police were trying to ID the individuals and compare them to several cold cases. Sheesh. Thank goodness Jenny survived to tell the tale. In 4th place, time to tell the tale of a rocking bed. Nope, not a rocking horse, rocking chair, or like an ottoman. A bed. I know water beds are out of style and like a major safety hazard, but maybe this could inspire them to come back. New nurse Demi was working one of her first ever overnight shifts when a relative of one of her patients raced into the nurse's station, out of breath, screaming that she needed to come quick. Unable to elaborate, saying Demi had to see what she was talking about for herself. Our nurse made her way to the room in question, where this little old lady patient was crying and holding onto the bed for dear life, all while her bed was shaking extremely violently. Now, you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking, but apparently she was this frail, practically emaciated older lady who didn't even possess the strength to rattle the rails. The ward only had 2 other patients in it, and everyone in there was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright until it eventually subsided. Apparently that particular ward was rarely used, and the bed that the old lady was in was used even less. People who have laid in it complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirit called dibs on that particular bed, and Demi would very much like it to pick somewhere else to hold court. Please and thanks. In 3rd place, we have the case of purple scrubs. Former EMT David O'Keefe worked mainly in transfers, and this particular client was always his last one of the day, having to return home late at night in the dark. She was an older woman who visited the hospital he was based out of for regular dialysis treatment. One specific day, she was being moved, and David was sitting in the back of the transport vehicle with her. She looked under the weather, so he asked what was wrong out of concern, and she said a man in purple had been visiting her. He asked if the man was, like a relative or a technician, but she shook her head. She said the man would sit next to her during dialysis appointments and stroke her hair. Thinking this was strange, right after he dropped her off at the hospital, David asked the hospital techs about, such a person, but no one had seen or remembered anyone wearing purple. Visitors also weren't really a thing at this part of the hospital, so he assumed the patient was just imagining it. While he was waiting to bring her back home, he saw the man in purple scrubs waiting outside that woman's room, watching her door. As David went to approach him, a bunch of tech personnel urgently ran past them into the woman's room, and David lost sight of the man. It turned out the woman in the room had suffered a heart attack and was sadly unable to be revived. Oh, and just a tiny creepy footnote, none of the staff in that hospital wore purple scrubs. In second place, we have a mystery mimic. Yeah, I'm fond of alliteration. How can you tell? This spooky story comes to us courtesy of former late-night transportation worker Betty. She worked the position for a few years, but after this incident, did everything possible to never work a nighttime shift ever again. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all laundry was done and all supplies were sorted and housed. On this particular night, Betty was the only one in the basement when she heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator and poked her head around the corner expecting to see her only coworker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. And so, she shrugged it off. That night in particular was slower in pace, so she opted to take a snack break and veg in the break room for a bed, when she heard a loud bang out of nowhere. Betty walked into the hallway and a bed was rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides of the walls. Now at this point, she assumed that her coworker was playing a prank on her, and she directly radioed him to chew him out, but he swore he was upstairs. Honestly, I'd be assuming the same. I've had a similar situation in a haunted house I used to work in at an old theater, but Betty was smart about it and determined to catch her coworker in the act. She started walking down the hallway, and as she passed the laundry room, all the machines started up. She poked her head in, expecting to find him, but the room was completely empty. Just a tiny worrisome spooky flag. Nothing to worry about, right? As she walked into the laundry room, the machines came to a complete stop. Betty froze at first before regaining her senses and making her way towards the elevator, when she heard whistling from the other end of the hall. Now at this point, she's certain that she's the only worker in the basement and is repeatedly pressing the elevator buttons in an attempt to rush it. As she was waiting for the elevator, things started falling off the shelves down the hall. Betty could only stare in shock as boxes of gloves, tissues, and packages of tubes fell off various racks one by one. Her entire body broke out in goosebumps, every hair standing on its end, and the feeling of being watched had completely consumed her thoughts. When the elevator finally arrived after what seemed like forever, Betty felt the sensation of someone brushing her arm and screamed in panic. Upon exiting the elevator upstairs, she made a beeline for the cafeteria, where her coworker actually was, and broke down explaining the entire ordeal. Now, before y'all ask, but Alexa, how was this spirit a mimic? Turns out that Betty usually whistles to herself at work at night, chats with the laundry folks during daytime shifts, and the items that fell off the shelf slowly were common items that she would have to retrieve. Big note for me on this one. In first place, we have terrified security staff. Security guard Mason claims that while he wants his location to stay anonymous, he used to work overnight security in one of the largest, best, and oldest hospitals in the USA. He and his fellow security officers all have stories about one building in particular, which was built in the late 1800s and was the original psychiatric building for this hospital. Now, being the late 1800s, not much was truly known about psychiatric disorders at that time. On top of that, this hospital was known for its medical research. Sadly, with what we all know about history, when you combine the two, that spells out a lot of nightmares. A couple years before Mason started working security there, this building in particular had been converted partially into offices after the newly built part of the hospital had dedicated a section for the updated psych ward. Mason's rounds for the first night of our tale happened to include, yep, you guessed it, that building. At night, this building was empty, due to most of the staff who worked in those offices leaving by 5 p.m. every day. Apparently some folks like to rush home, which is fair, but they would leave their office doors unlocked, which was a big no-no, due to medical information being located in their offices. Big confidential stuff. Kinda want to keep that locked up. It was security's job to go to each floor, make sure every door was locked, and if it wasn't, to secure it themselves. Mason did his initial sweep of the building to make sure it was clear of people, and then proceeded to do door checks. The hallways were pretty narrow, so he could check both sides of the hallway's doors at once. At the end of this hallway, there were 2 sets of doors you had to go through to reach the final office, which was a dead end, so you had to come back out, go the other way. He noticed everything was secure, so he was ready to move on to the next floor. He exited the 2 sets of doors from the dead end office and froze at what he saw. Every door that he had already checked was completely ajar and set so perfectly so that their own weight wouldn't cause them to shut again. A single wheelchair had appeared at the end of the hallway and was facing towards the steps. Mason had heard other security officers outright reject that set of rounds due to the strange stuff that was happening, but he originally laughed it off until that night. He went around and forced the now open door shut and tried to shrug it off. Nothing else weird happened that night, and he returned the next night to patrol the miners' ward. The area was just under construction, so security was needed to make sure nobody got hurt by accident and all the workers were doing their job. Safety first. When Mason was hanging out in the break room before his shift officially started, other security guards were discussing various reports of seeing a young, human, with brown hair who would disappear randomly, and Mason dismissed this as just gossip meant to spook off the newbies. An hour into making his rounds, a foreman who had stayed late called security and asked for a security officer to come up because, quote, a youngin' with brown hair had locked himself in a room and he didn't want him to get hurt with all the open wires in there. Mason answered the call, went and unlocked the door for the foreman, and looked in a 20x8 room for about 10 minutes, and upon seeing no one, called it in as a false alarm. He attempted to shrug it off until he received a call for backup in the psych ward, and when he arrived he noticed a patient was in a state of panic near the remnants of a shattered chandelier. Now, before he had experienced the abnormal happenings in this building, Mason claims he would have written off his testimony as idiocy. But the patient claimed that something held him in that spot as the chandelier started swinging wildly until it started to fall. When it started to fall, he was let go and allowed to move, and scrambled out of the way before it hit him. Now, this was the beginning of the end for Mason, who requested to be transferred to hospitals the next day. And as much as I love the Phantom of the Opera, I don't really want it to become reality. One of my favorite things to say in accordance with that is that I love one fictional toxic tenor, and only one. Emphasis on fictional. And that brings us to the end of our list for today. What do you folks think? As much as I enjoy a good ooky spooky building exploration, I prefer them in daylight for a reason, and this list only helps to prove my point. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you ever experienced something scary in a hospital, and as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more from us here at Top 5 Scary Videos.